Welcome back to Intercultural Engagement. I'm Dr. Smith. Before we can really dive into our journey, we need to settle on what we mean when we're talking about culture. And to talk about culture, we're also going to talk a little bit about communication because a lot of the scholarship around intercultural communication sees those two concepts working hand in hand. So the first question is, what is culture? When you think of culture, what comes into your mind? Is it going to a restaurant and having a particular kind of food that maybe was developed in a certain part of the world or a certain country or by a certain ethnic group? Or is it clothing? Or is it architecture? What are the things that make up culture? That's what we're going to try to answer here in this lesson. And there's a few questions that I want percolating in the front of your mind as we're talking about this. First, how does my culture, once we decide what that is, how does it affect my behavior and my beliefs and my values? And then secondly, what are the keys to understanding culture and its effect on my relationship with other people, especially other people from other cultural backgrounds? If you've already done the reading, you understand that my colleague and I talk about entering into intercultural spaces, and it's when this thing, culture, becomes salient. That means it becomes important. It gets in the way. It becomes something that we can't avoid, and it changes the situation. It changes the landscape. The third question that I want you to think about is, how can I become better at establishing and nurturing friendships with people from other cultures? That's something that takes a little bit of thought, practice, and perseverance. And then lastly, we want to ask the question, what is the mechanism for perpetuating or sharing culture? How do cultures survive? So let's think about these questions as we quickly go through a number of concepts. First, let's define culture. We're going to say that culture is characterized by a number of properties. And so this definition captures some of those properties. So culture is a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, which constitute your worldview, values, which make up your moral matrix, norms, which are all those customs and traditions that you and your family practice, some of them that you're oblivious to, some of them that you're very intentional about. For instance, especially holiday practices like putting up a Christmas tree and how you decorate it and the foods you make around Christmas. And some of you who come from particular cultural backgrounds maybe make particular kinds of food that you really only make around the holidays. And then those social practices that get encoded into society, those socio-political practices and economic structures that are group level macro phenomena that really also reflect your culture. And all of those things, those values, norms, social practices, beliefs, they affect our daily thoughts and behaviors. And it is lastly a group phenomenon. This is not something that you have all by yourself. That's the difference between a personality and a culture. A personality is something that I have, and I am idiosyncratic about that. My personality is unique to me, but my culture, those are things that I share with groups of other people. All right, so this is going to be our definition. And you can see that part of that culture is acquired through socialization. I am taught how to behave and some of these practices and beliefs by my family, by my education system, by my church community and other communities. And some of it I acquire through enculturation, which means as I'm walking through life, I observe other people and their ways and their practices and what they think and believe, and I begin to adopt those things for myself. So that is both socialization and enculturation. And you can see that all these concepts are kind of interconnected. We are separating concepts in order to talk about them and identify uniquenesses, but they definitely interrelate with each other. And then a lot of what constitutes culture is symbolic. that it's encoded into our world with different symbols and representations. And it also isn't static. It doesn't stay the same. It changes over time. Some things change more slowly over time, like beliefs, but other things like norms, traditions, practices, social practices, can change pretty quickly, especially as different groups collide and interact with each other. And then we find that culture is also something that, as we mentioned before, has material artifacts like food and architecture and clothing, but a lot of culture, in fact, some people say up to 80% of culture, it really takes place in our mind. It's the wet matter up here, and it's how we see the world. And so people who approach the world from a constructivist mindset, meaning that we create with each other through dialogue our social realities, that we co-create or co-construct our cultural world. And so culture has both a mind aspect and a material aspect. So when we think about culture, which actually is a fairly recent term to be coined by scholars to describe communities that live together and create social practices and community together. E.B. Tyler was the first one, at least in English, in the English language literature, to coin that term and talk about communities as defined by these cultural variables. So what we want to remember is that culture is first learned. It's not something you're born with. Culture is also shared by groups. It's distinct from personality. Culture is also unconscious, both in its acquisition, in large part, and also in its expression. We often go about our daily business very unaware of our own culture, and it's not until we're plucked out of our culture that we become aware of it and conscious of it. So it's similar to a fish that swims around in the lake water until you pull it out of the lake, then it realizes it's no longer in its environment, in its culture, and it's getting very uncomfortable the longer it's out. And unlike fish, we can get used to another cultural environment and adapt to it, but it does take some doing. And then we also need to remember that it includes products of the mind and material. And then also, it's all interconnected. Our language is interconnected with our perceptions and our belief system and our values. And even those values come through in our social practices and our business etiquette and things like that. And then it's also very symbolic. There are scholars that suggest that communication is culture and culture is communication. So they're really two sides of the same coin. Those are the features that we are going to emphasize and use throughout this course as we talk about culture. Now, there's one other thing about culture that we need to keep in mind, and that is that it's ethnocentric, or we are ethnocentric. And what we mean by that is all cultures, all groups who have these shared practices and ways of being, they see themselves as the center of the world. And I'm going to prove that to you here in a second. So we call that ethnocentrism. Ethne, people group, and centric. So ethnocentrism means that I conceive of myself as the center or the standard of the world, that this is the way. Many cultures around the world, the name for themselves means the people or the real people. Many Native American tribes have a word for themselves that essentially translated into English means the real people. And that is common around the world to think of yourself that way, and it's ethnocentric. So notice this map. What do you notice about it? And specifically about the USA or even North America. So think about that. What we've done, or what Rand McNally has done, or whoever the creator of this map is, they have placed North America and the US, they are a US company that developed this particular projection and printed this map. And particularly when this projection was created, there was a global hostility between what was then the USSR and the United States. They were the two reigning superpowers, and so naturally a map should cut Russia now in half because they were the enemy, right? And the US is front and center, right in the middle. Who's the most important? Right in the middle of the map. Now you might say, oh, that's so ethnocentric of those North Americans. Well, this is a universal phenomenon. Remember that. Ethnocentrism is not unique to any culture. It's universal. So here's a map produced by China. Guess what? China is in the center of the world. They see themselves as the most important. And here's a map by Australia. This is sometimes called the turnabout map of the world. And you can see Australia, who doesn't want to be down under, they're up on top of everyone else, and they're right in the center of the map. Okay, so this map is obviously a little tongue-in-cheek, but the point stands that every culture is ethnocentric. One of the things about culture is that we know it's pervasive in its influence. And as Patty Lane observed, our culture shapes who we are, what we believe, how we behave, and at no point can we unzip it and take it off. We can't take off our culture and set it aside to have interactions or to be who we are. It's always with us. It's in all of our relationships, all of our thinking, and all of our processing about the world around us. So Lane is absolutely correct about the influence of culture. Now, often culture is modeled using an iceberg to get at that 80%, 20% concept. And what do we mean by that? Let's unpack this model just a little bit, because we're going to refer to the iceberg quite a bit in our thinking about culture and our applications about culture. So we already mentioned that when we think about culture, we often think about those things that are up on top of the surface of the water, right? The top of the iceberg, which is that 20% that's sticking out. And so food, clothing, history, architecture, even things that we might, interact with and not consciously think about at the time, but like the extent of eye contact, or what eye contact means. There's this rule in U.S. Euro-American culture that eye contact, it means you're paying attention, right? And it can also communicate intimacy. But for sure, this idea of attention. So when you're sitting in a classroom, you should engage in eye contact with the teacher. Or when you're listening to a speaker, you should engage in eye contact with that speaker. And what it communicates is that you're paying attention. I had an experience teaching some young Native Americans many years ago, and I was told beforehand, going into this context, to just understand that for a younger Native American to engage in direct eye contact with somebody who's superior to them was seen as impolite. And so they would intentionally defer their eye contact. They wouldn't look directly at the speaker. And so what might appear as a lack of attention was really them conveying respect. So that top 20%, the top of the iceberg that's above the water, we call that objective culture or conscious culture. It's things that we're aware of, those holiday customs and norms that we bump into on a daily basis, or that we might actually seek out, like food and different kinds of clothing. What trips us up is what's under the surface, the 80% that we're unaware of. And so this is often called subconscious or subjective culture. Right? We're not aware of it. It's something that's under the surface, and so we tend to trip over this. And another scholar, an anthropologist called Edward Hall, he talked about these things as having, there's formal subconscious or subjective culture, there's informal, and then there's technical subjective culture. And I won't go into all of that now. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But just be aware that there are different kinds of subjective culture under the surface that we trip over. And you can pause the video and look at these different things here. I think you'll see there's a lot of different things that are under the surface that we can trip over, because different cultures approach these things differently. And one of the key ones that people run into when they travel or go into other cultures often first is a different sense of time. And some cultures make fun of themselves because if they're an immigrant culture in another setting, in a new country, often they'll laugh at themselves because they are on their own culture's kind of time. So for instance, here in St. Paul, Minnesota, we have a large population of Karen immigrants. And the Karen, talk about Karen time or Kenya time, which is their name for themselves. So Kenya time is not as punctual, not as on time as Euro-American time. And so they giggle and laugh about that. So-and-so is on Kenya time. right? So this is the idea of culture, and that culture is not all above the surface. A lot of it, and what we're trying to learn about and pay attention to, become aware of, is that 80% of subjective culture that Harry Triandis, a cross-cultural psychologist, said is a characteristic way of perceiving a social environment, but you don't communicate that out loud. It's just your way of perceiving the environment, but the outside group doesn't know about it. So what culture does is it creates a lens through which we see the world. And just like a camera lens, it helps us to focus in on things. And every culture has a different aperture and ISO, and so and resolution. And so this lens really changes how we see the world. I want you to think for a second as we wrap this up, what are some of the core values and assumptions, the lens that marks U.S. culture? And pause the video if you need to and write down a few of those things and try to think of the things that characterize U.S. culture as a whole. What we would say is these are the trademarks, and a better way or another way to look at it is, what do other people notice about Americans, and what would they say characterizes American culture? So these are some of the characteristics that are often applied to U.S. Americans. And this, we won't spend time going through each one of these, but look over this list and ask yourself if it resonates with you. The first and foremost quality that people often point out is Americans are so individualistic. It's all about me. I'm the center of the world. I have goals. I have aspirations. I'm going to provide for me and my nuclear family, right? It's about me and my people, it's usually a very small or somewhat small group. Okay? Or competition. Americans are known for competition, and that everything, whether it's in sports or promotions in a business, it's all about competition. And incentives, for instance. There's all kinds of applications here. Or even the idea of directness and openness in our communication tends to be a very American feature or value. So think about that. These are some of the things that characterize U.S. culture. How about Bethel culture? What would you say are some of those key cultural characteristics of Bethel? I'm actually going to have you write down some of those, and you are going to post those in a forum to talk about, well, what constitutes, now that you know what culture is, what constitutes Bethel's culture? One of the beautiful things about culture is that if we think about Imago Dei, this idea that God created human beings and we are created in His image, well, if all human beings are created in God's image, guess what? They all reflect, in that beautiful diversity of cultures, they all reflect God. So Bernard Adney tried to capture this in a beautiful statement. He says, each person, each culture has a unique secret. Each is capable of knowing something of God, which no one else knows. In the meeting of strangers, people from different cultural backgrounds, we have the opportunity to share that treasure with each other. So I hope that's part of the treasure and the value that you take away from this course, is that idea of trying to understand people from different backgrounds, different cultures, be more successful at communicating with them and seeing something of God that you hadn't learned or known yet.